Now let's go ahead and start animating a skip. Now, the skip is probably most centered around the foot placement and the foot pattern. So when I animate this, I'm going to focus on the feet first and then work my way up to the upper body. Now, the first pose of a skip is the extended position, which is pretty much the same position that we have in a walk. So I've already gone ahead and put that in place. And basically, the feet are apart, and then the hips are rotated so that the right hip is forward because the right foot is forward. And then the shoulders are rotated in the opposite direction so that everything matches up. But we're going to focus mostly on the lower body. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the upper body so we can focus just on foot placement. Now, when we start animating a skip, we need to understand both the timing and the spacing of the skip. Now, this will be different for every character, but for a generic skip, I tend to time the hop at about 1.5 times the step. So if the step is 8 frames, the hop is 12 frames. And the same goes for distance. So again, I wanted the character moving forward at a steady rate. So if the step is 10 units, the hop will be 15. Again, 1.5 times the length of the step or the stride length. So if this stride length is, say, 10, then the hop will be 15. So let's go ahead and start animating the main poses. Now, the next pose after the extended position or after the step is the cushion position where the character gets ready to take her hop. So I'm going to time that about half the length of a step. In other words, about 4 frames in. Okay, I've got 8 frames per step, so this is about halfway through the step, is about 4 frames in. And this will be equivalent to a passing position. So I'm going to select the hips and we're going to basically move them down and forward just a bit. Okay, and I want to get those pretty far forward, almost so that it's over the foot. So again, we want to get her crouching into position here. And I want to make sure that I get a key for each one of these. And I want to make sure that that foot is planted and also has a key. So now she's basically just kind of leaning into this. I'm going to go ahead and push these knee placers out a little bit. So now she's kind of leaning into that. And now the back foot here, in other words, the left foot, that is going to start to swing forward. And so what's going to happen is that this foot's going to act almost like a pendulum and it's going to help give the character more momentum into the leap. So this is already starting to swing forward. So I'm going to go ahead and position it so that this knee is just slightly behind the other knee to give it a little bit of asymmetry. And then just rotate that foot back because it's going to be dragging behind the motion of the leg. So just get a good pose for that. And then another thing that I need to do is go ahead and take the hips and square them off. Now, this is kind of like a passing position, so the hips are going to be fairly square. Now, I could rotate the hips forward and back, but I'm going to wait until I get the upper body into play before I do that. So that way I can get a better visual reference of how far forward to rotate the hips. So the hips are square. The body is crouched, and then that left leg is starting to swing forward. And let's make sure we get keys for everything. So let's go ahead and see what we have. So as you can see, we already are starting to get some animation here. So we're starting to get that character getting ready to take off. And so the takeoff itself is going to be fairly fast. So I'm going to make that about 2 frames. I'm going to scroll forward to about frame 7. And so these hips are actually going to move forward and up. Okay, so I want to get that leg almost completely stretched, that right leg. So I'm going to move it pretty far forward, something about like that. I want to get it just so that the heel is about to leave the ground there. So get it pretty straight here on this hip. And make sure I get a key for this foot here. And I actually am going to go ahead and play with the heel on this foot here. So I want to make sure that I get just a little bit of lift on that heel. So she's starting to push off with the ball of her feet. So you can see I'm getting a little bit of flexibility to that foot. So now she's going She's crouching down and then pushing her weight up. Now this back leg here is just going to continue to swing forward. So I'm going to take that left foot and just start to swing it forward, something like that. And again, I could adjust the rotation a little bit so that it appears as though it's dragging behind. And again, make sure I have keys for everything. So now you can see we've got pretty good takeoff. Now the next thing to do is to actually animate the hop. Now I can do this one of two ways. I can actually animate it sequentially, so I can go to the middle of the hop, animate that pose, and then go to the end and animate that pose. But I find that's not the most effective way. I like to let the computer kind of figure out where the middle point is. So what I'm going to do is actually go to the very end, animate that, and then go back to my middle position. So I need to figure out how long this is. Now I've got 8 frames per step. So I'm starting my leap here at frame 5. I've got 8 frames per step, which means my hop is going to be 12, or in other words, 1.5 times that. So I'm going to go 12 ahead of 5. Okay, right here is where everything starts, where her hop is starting. So 5 plus 12 is 17. And so that's where she's going to land. So how far does she go? Well, she goes about 1.5 times the stride length. So in this case, my stride length for my character was about 16. So I'm going to put her forward an additional 24. Okay, yours may be different, so don't use my units as gospel here. And then I'm going to select the hip and just move that forward and get it just to the point where it's almost basically just above that foot. Okay, so basically I want it to be right about there. And so what we're getting here is she's basically just sliding forward. Now the pose for the left foot is going to be in front of the knee. So basically I'm going to move this forward and also rotate this up because we're about to set that foot down into another step. So this is almost like the anticipation or the last pose of a standard walk cycle. A little bit different, but somewhere in that range there. So now we've got this. We've basically got her sliding into place. But my motion is fairly consistent, so my in-betweens are pretty good, and I can use that in-between to get this middle position. So the middle position is going to be somewhere around 11. And this is where she's actually in the middle of her hop. This is the high point of the hop. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the hips and move those up fairly far. I'm going to go ahead and move them up somewhere around there, maybe a little bit back, somewhere around there. And then I'm going to go ahead and select the right foot, which is going to be the downward foot here, and just make sure that I get a pretty good bend to that leg there. So what I'm trying to do is get this as almost as straight as possible because this foot's going to be dragging the most behind. And I want to make sure I get keys for those. And then this left foot here, this is actually going to be kind of your profile of this skip. And this is really one of the more important parts of this pose is you want to get that foot out so that you can see that it's off the ground. And this is kind of where you can have a little bit of fun in terms of posing here. But I'm just going to go ahead and put this out right about there. So now you can see that the character is hopping, right, like that. So go step, cushion, push off, and then the hop. And then the last pose is really just the second half of that walk. So it's about 4 frames ahead. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and put this foot down and zero it out, move it forward, and we're just going to do another step here. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate that down, make sure, put it into position here. Now this is basically just the stride length, so it depends on your character as to what that's going to be, but it's going to be the same as it was on the first pose. And then go ahead and move the hips into place. And we have to rotate. Remember, this is a standard sort of walk here, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate so that that left hip is forward. And this is a little out of place here. I need to move this over. It's kind of got a little out of place here. And let's go ahead and just straighten some of this stuff out. Okay. So I want to make sure I get keys for everything. Make sure I get a key set for all of these. And this should be pretty close. So now, okay, actually what I found is when animating from the side, this is a little bit off. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I get that correct. There we go. There we go. Okay, so let's take a look at this from a little bit better perspective. So now she gets into the pose, hops, lands, steps, okay? So that's basically the pattern, okay? That's the pattern for 1 foot. So you get crouch, push, hop, land, step. Okay, so those sequence of poses are the skip for 1 foot. Now we need to do the other foot, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Let's just go ahead and complete that. Now this one is animated a total of 20 frames for both the step and the hop. So the next one should be an additional 20 frames for a total of 40 frames.